Hi everyone. Today I'll be talking about doing research, the art and the science of discovering what is already known about a topic that you're trying to find out more about. First thing to determine when you're doing research is what is it that you need to know. So you might have a subject as large as nuclear energy, but maybe you have particular things you need to know about nuclear energy, like what does it cost, or where is it produced? What are the dangers of nuclear energy? So you need to know specifically what you're looking for. Another thing you need to think about is where are you likely to find this information? Is this a topic that you're only going to be able to find current information on the internet? Is this something that there's been a lot of book research done, magazines, etc.? Are you likely to find good information in a film, or is there someone you can interview for a primary source? So find out where you're likely to find your information. Finally, what are you going to do with the information once you find it? Do you need to write a paper? Are you going to make a film? So depending on what you're going to do with the research eventually might have a bearing on how you start to look. So you need to learn to be a good searcher in order to be a good researcher, especially when we have so much information so readily available to us. One thing we've already talked about is using advanced search tools like Google Advanced Search, which lets you narrow by domain type or by site type what you're looking for. Understand what kinds of domain names mean what kinds of sites. So what does edu mean? What does .gov mean? What does it mean if you're looking for a university in another country? What would the domain name be then? So starting to understand something about that is important. Finally, knowing the difference between different kinds of sources. We've talked about getting as close to the primary information as you can in order to find out what's the most accurate information. So now Mr. Hayden's going to tell you about the difference between primary sources and secondary sources, or actually mainly he's going to talk about what a primary source is. Take it away, Mr. Hayden.
Hey Galileo students, so you've been asked to find some primary sources, and you're probably asking yourself, what is a primary source? Well, primary source is a document that includes research or interviews or information that came directly from the source. So, for example, in science, publications in journals that came from the researchers, from the scientists, from universities are a primary source. In history, oftentimes letters from people who actually experienced events are used as the primary source. And in journalism or in writing newspaper articles, they interview people to get primary source data.
All right, now for another treat, Ms. Nelson is going to talk about working with sources once you found them. What should you be thinking about before you start to actually take notes?
My section for the research guide on this screencast is to talk about using sources. So the first question you should ask yourself is the source relevant to your topic? Pick one that actually applies to the work that you're doing. Don't waste time. Next question you should ask yourself, does the source provide information you haven't found elsewhere? If you already know it and you've already documented it, you probably don't need that source. If it's new and original information, then use it. Next question, can you learn anything about the author, and does what you learn inspire confidence? Do you know where your source is coming from? Do you understand the education and experience and validity of the people who are writing it? Do you trust them? Fourth question, is the source current enough? If you're looking at current history, how far back does it go? Does it talk about what's happening right now, the topic that you're researching? Have circumstances changed since this text was published? There are many sources out there that are outdated and perhaps even inaccurate because we have found out new information. So make sure that your source is current. Sixth question, is the author an expert? Do they know what they're talking about? Do they have their credentials? Do they have the experience and education to be writing? And finally, is the information biased? Most sources are biased. Know what the bias is, understand what the point of view is, and make sure that you find another source to have balance.
Hello again. So once you've selected your sources, you're ready to start taking and making notes or recording your research and your thinking about your research so that you can use it later. The first thing you need to do even before you start taking notes is decide what method you're going to use for taking your notes. Remember that there's no reason to take notes unless they're usable to you. So you want to have a method that works for you and that makes your notes usable later. Some of the systems you've already learned are Cornell Notes, and also you've learned Plan Notes, and you'll learn a couple of other systems as the year goes on. But the important thing again is to choose a method that works for you and makes your notes usable later on. So as you start to take notes, the first thing to remember is that you have to write down bibliographic information immediately before you start taking notes. You're going to have to cite your sources later, and it's a real pain if you have to go back and try to reconstruct that after the fact. You should record each source on a separate page or document. You don't want to get information from multiple sources mixed up because, again, you'll run into trouble when you start to try to cite your sources correctly. Finally, as you're taking notes, you should summarize information instead of just copying, pasting, and writing it down verbatim, because then you run into a real risk of plagiarizing, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And you should use abbreviations so that you are economic in the way that you write down information. So use some kind of a formatting system. Use bullets, numbers, indents, etc. to, again, make your notes legible to yourself and to make the information and its relationship to other information make sense to you. So, why should you cite sources? You have to cite sources because not doing so is plagiarism, which is stealing somebody else's ideas and information. So every time you use information that is substantially that of somebody else or directly quote from someone else, you have to attribute that information to them. Otherwise, it's just dishonest. And we, of course, want to give people credit for their own ideas. There are two main systems of citing sources, APLA and MLA. And for social sciences and for Galileo projects, you're going to be using APA. In English, you'll use MLA. One of the main differences is that when you cite sources in text, like in a paper, the parenthetical, meaning in parentheses, citation is slightly different. In APA, you put the author's name, the date, and the page with a P. For MLA, you just put the author's name and the page with no P. So you just have to figure out what source your teacher, professor, or whatever is expecting and use that source. Whenever you use multiple sources for a project or a paper, you're going to want to include a works cited page, or sometimes you'll be asked to do a full bibliography. So the difference is that a bibliography is all the sources that you've used in the course of the project. Whether you end up using them finally in your paper or not, they're part of your research. And a works cited page is just the sources that are cited in your paper or are used in your project if it's a film or something. So bibliography is the full sources, works cited, or just the sources cited in your paper. So good luck with your research.